Start, sir.
Okay. A very good evening to all of you for this day 2 course for the Indian Society of Hypertension and CERDIA's course in hypertension management, a case-based approach. So today we have very interesting deliberations coming up. We have two very interesting topics, and we of course have an expert panel of three eminent uh, experts from the country. We'll have Dr. Tirthankar Chaudhary, Dr. Soumik Goswami, and we'll have Dr. Sandeep Mahajan. So it'll be a very interesting and enriching session for all. So before we delve into the details of the session and start the proceedings of the day, this is me, Dr. Arun Sharma from CERDIA Pharmaceuticals. Allow me a minute to just give you a brief glimpse of the work that we are doing and just to tell you who we are. So as we all know, CERDIA, an Indian affiliate of Servier, is an international group which is governed by a non-profit foundation. And we are an entirely independent group, and every day 100 million people worldwide are treated with our medicines. When it comes to cardiology, we are a force to be reckoned with. We are second in the Europe and fifth worldwide. And as a group policy, every year, 25% of the revenue is invested back into R&D. So what does CERDIA stand for? CERDIA has always been for brands produced in India, that is vocal for Make in India, even before it was a thing. We do not have any dependency on Chinese API since all the raw material is sourced from a single factory in Europe. So you can have a uniform standards across the globe for all Servier medicines. And these are some of the marketed drugs in India across cardiovascular disease, diabetes, CVD, and other neuropsychiatric disorders as well. Before we start the program, a big thank you from our end to all the healthcare professionals, pharmacists, and those involved in supply chain to help us and guide us through these turbulent times during and after the pandemic. So we thank you all for your service, and we hope that you will help us get through this turbulent waters. So coming to the agenda for the day, we are on day 2 of the ISH and CERDIA certificate course in hypertension management. So today's session will have two topics relevant to hypertension in diabetes and patient with CKD. We will have the session moderated by Dr. Tirthankar Chaudhary, and the two eminent speakers for the day are Dr. Soumik Goswami and Dr. Sandeep Mahajan. So this is how the agenda for the day sits. Post the introduction, we'll have the two sessions, first by Dr. Soumik, then by Dr. Sandeep. Each session will have a 15-minute case-based presentation with a 10-minute panel discussion followed by a Q&A at 5 minutes each, and then we'll end with the closing and a vote of thanks. So allow me to introduce our eminent moderator for the day, a name that does not need any formal introduction. Of course, Dr. Tirthankar Chaudhary, who's an endocrinologist. He's Senior Consultant Diabetes and Endocrinology at Apollo Hospital, Calcutta. And when it comes to publication, Sir has publications in eminent journals like In Journal Diabetes, BMJ Diabetes, Springer, JAPI, and JIMA. Sir has been principal investigator in several international phase 3 studies like Devote, Sustain, Leader, or landmark trials. So he's a reviewer of various journals right from Indian Journal of Dermatology, BMJ, Journal of Diabetes Research and Care. Sir is a faculty and course director for diabetes, thyroid, cardiodiabetes, and hypertension at PHFI New Delhi. And there have been a lot of awards going the way. And name a few: Certificate of Distinction for Medical Education and Patient Care by PHFI New Delhi, and also Certificate for Distinguished Work in Medical Education and Patient Care by Calcutta Municipality Corporation, Calcutta. So I welcome Dr. Tirthankar Chaudhary, sir, and I request him to take the proceedings of the day ahead, and he can introduce the two speakers. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Arun, for your kind words, and I feel very humbled. And
I think as we get the ball rolling, should I introduce, do I have the introductory slide? Yes. So I've got a very close associate of mine, Dr. Shaumi Goswami. He will be, as you know, that he is also a very eminent person in endocrinology, and he needs no introduction. But I would still say that he's an associate editor of Indian Journal of Endocrinology and Metabolism. He's a joint secretary of Diabetes Association of India, West Bengal. He has got 47 publications in indexed journals. He is faculty and in charge of research lab in endocrinology, NRS Medical College, Kolkata. So with this introduction, I think before I hand over the mic to Shaumi, I just wanted to set the ball rolling by saying that when we discuss hypertension, one thing that always comes to my mind, that is about blood pressure measurement. And there's nothing more critical than discussing hypertension to start off with measurement of hypertension. And all of us are aware that how blood pressures have been often measured in the office by the nurses or healthcare associates, even in winter over the sweaters and coats. So it is very important that when we talk of hypertension, for the audience of today, that a good measurement of blood pressure is fundamental in discussing blood pressure issues this evening. We also know that the cuff size varies a lot. There are different ones. We know that a small adult has 22 to 26 centimeter of cuff size. Then you have got an adult with something around 26 to 36. Then you get a bigger cuff size, which is up to 36 to 45. And then you get a very big. So with this introduction, I just wanted to make you aware that the fundamental issue is measuring blood pressure. And then we can, of course, go into the discussion. So can I hand over the mic to Shaumi for starting this?
Thank you, sir. So as I start sharing my screen,
Yes.
and I'll be discussing mainly on management of hypertension in patients with diabetes. Now, what I feel is that if you look at it, there's a striking similarity, and it's interesting, between the management of COVID-19, if you put it that way, and the management of hypertension and diabetes. Because of the fact that in both these conditions, we have a host of published evidence, but again, the guidelines are inconsistent. They do not seem to follow each other. And the difference, basic difference here is that COVID-19 is a 6-month-old disease which we are managing, whereas we are managing hypertension and diabetes at least for the last 60 years. So it's amazing that still today, the guidelines have certain differences amongst themselves. And as Dr. Tirthankar Choudhury put it very prominently across, it's very important to know how to measure blood pressure before stamping an individual to have hypertension and diabetes. I consider that we all know the basics of blood pressure measurement, and from that point onwards, I'll take forward the discussion regarding the evidence that we have with relation to management of hypertension and diabetes. So we begin with a patient, a very common patient whom we get to see every day, a 60-year-old man with diabetes, dyslipidemia for the last 6 years, with normal renal function, who is recently diagnosed to have hypertension, and we consider that the diagnosis was made keeping in mind the prerequisites for a correct blood pressure measurement. His blood pressure was 148/96 millimeters of mercury. Using the ACC-AHA risk calculator, his 10-year risk of developing an atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease event was around 20%. He was advised to start hydrochlorothiazide 12.5 milligrams after breakfast daily. 2 months later, during follow-up, his blood pressure had come down to 138/88 millimeters of mercury. At this point of time, he is asked to stay on hydrochlorothiazide and come again after 6 months for follow-up. Now, without going into whether what we did was correct or what we did was wrong, what we'll be discuss over the next 15 minutes or so is what's the overall evidence regarding the target blood pressure that we need to achieve in our patient, what we did correct or what we did could be improved, what is the best drug sort of to begin treatment in patients with type 2 diabetes and hypertension, and of course, beyond these two, beyond the target blood pressure and the drug to be used, is there anything else which needs to be kept in mind as well? Now, having said that, without going into what is correct, what is wrong, let us have a look at what our audience is thinking today. So given the patient that I discussed, 60-year-old individual, diabetes, dyslipidemia, normal renal function, blood pressure, hypertension diagnosed recently, what would be your target blood pressure for this patient? And you have 4 options in front of you: A, B, C, or D.
So votes are coming in, sir. We'll give some more time, at least 20-30 seconds.
Okay.
We have some more votes coming in. I think another 15 seconds would be.
Okay, as you wish.
Another 10 seconds, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Right, sir. So 77% people have gone with option A.
Okay.
And then 10, you have 9% with option D.
Okay. So we see that the majority feels it's less than 130 by 80, and a small number do feel that it could be less than 140 by 90. We'll go into the evidence very soon. Before that, one more question before we go into the evidence. Which drug would you like to use in this patient? Suppose you begin with monotherapy in this patient. Which drug would you like to use? Would it be A, B, C, or D, a diuretic, as we did in this case? Which one of the 4 options would you like to begin with in this patient?
We have some answers coming in. I think another 20 seconds. Okay. Another 15 seconds, sir. Okay. Another 10 seconds, sir. Okay, so 92% have gone with option A, sir.
Okay. So overwhelming majority have gone with A again. So I think that most of the audience today feels that the target blood pressure should be less than 130/80, and a RAS inhibitor should be the one with which to initiate treatment. And I think that we'll come across the evidence, look across the evidence, and find out what would be the correct answer at the end of this session. Now, before going into the target blood pressure and which drug to use in hypertension with diabetes, let us look at 2 areas where we don't have a lot of controversy, where we have more or less a single correct answer. What would be the systolic blood pressure for initiating antihypertensive therapy? Now we have good data, big data, robust data, which tells us that if your systolic blood pressure is more than 140 millimeters of mercury, and you begin antihypertensive drug therapy, you do get benefits. If you begin antihypertensive drug therapy with a systolic blood pressure of less than 140 millimeter of mercury, you do not get cardiovascular benefits. At the same time, you could also increase the risk of cardiovascular mortality in certain individuals with hypertension and diabetes. So the systolic blood pressure for initiating therapy would be 140 millimeters of mercury for initiating drug therapy. Regarding the diastolic blood pressure, it's considered to be 90 millimeters of mercury. But having said that, there is data that in patients with diabetes and hypertension and microalbuminuria, you could even begin therapy, drug therapy, with diastolic blood pressure levels less than 90 millimeters of mercury. The other area where there is no controversy, which we know with solid data, is that if you have diabetes and hypertension, as denoted by the red line, your risk of dying from coronary heart disease is 2 to 5-fold greater than if you have hypertension without diabetes. So diabetes complicates hypertension. And when both are put together, you have a far higher risk of dying. And what is interesting is that if you look at these two lines, the top line, red one, diabetes with hypertension, the yellow line is hypertension without diabetes. You'll find that the slopes are different, which means that at lower levels of blood pressure, someone with diabetes will have a far higher risk of dying. The curves are separated by a wider distance than at higher levels of blood pressure. Meaning that for a patient with diabetes and hypertension, even at lower levels of blood pressure, say 120, 130 millimeters of mercury, your risk of dying from cardiovascular disease is higher compared to someone without diabetes. Now, this could be important because when we are treating diabetes with hypertension, possibly our targets should be lower and we should be more cautious, more vigilant to keep the blood pressure at a sufficiently low level in patients with diabetes and hypertension. Now, as I said, the guidelines are inconsistent. If you look at the targets set out by guidelines in the recent past, over the last 2 to 3 years, many international guidelines have gone for a more stringent target of less than 130 by 80 millimeters of mercury. On the other hand, if you look at the ADA 2020 guidelines and the position statement, or rather the working statement brought out by the JNC aid group, they said that a blood pressure of less than 140 by 90 is what should be targeted in patients with diabetes and hypertension. But having said that, the ADA also said that this target of less than 140 by 90 is for patients with diabetes and hypertension with low or intermediate risk of having an atherosclerotic cardiovascular event. If you have established atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, or if your 10-year risk of developing atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is high, more than or equal to 15%, then you could very well target a lower blood pressure goal of less than 130 by 80 millimeters of mercury, provided it can be attained without significant adverse effects. So again, there is some inconsistency between the guidelines, but in the recent past, most of the guidelines have shifted to a goal of less than 130 by 80 for patients with diabetes and hypertension. And if you look at data which tries to find out the optimum systolic blood pressure goal in patients with diabetes and hypertension, till date, there is only one published trial, which was a prospective randomized controlled trial, which tried to answer this question, which was the ACCORD-BP trial. About 4,700 individuals with diabetes and hypertension were divided into two groups. They were to attain either a target blood pressure of less than 120 in one group or less than 140 in the other group, and followed up for nearly 5 years of time. The mean systolic blood pressure attained in the intensive group was around 19 millimeter of mercury, while that in the other group was 134 millimeter of mercury. At the end of nearly 5 years of follow-up, the cardiovascular composite outcome did not reduce significantly in the more intensive group. But if you look at subgroup analysis, there was a definite decrease in stroke and there was a definite improvement in albuminuria risk in those who attained the lower systolic blood pressure. However, this improvement in stroke and albuminuria came at the cost of an increase in serious adverse effects like hypotension, bradycardia, and hyperkalemia. Although none of these adverse effects were permanent, they were reversible, and none of these adverse effects led to a serious cardiovascular event or even death. So adverse effects were there, but they were reversible. There were stroke and renal benefits, but the overall cardiovascular benefit was not there. And importantly, what needs to be considered is that the ACCORD-BP trial used automated oscillatory blood pressure measurement. It did not use office manual blood pressure measurement, which is about 10 millimeters of mercury higher compared to the automated measurement. So I think if we look at this trial practically, if we are to relate to office blood pressure measurement, a systolic blood pressure attained around 125 to 130 would correspond to the 119 in the ACCORD-BP trial, where you would get stroke and albuminuria benefits at the cost of increased adverse effects. Now coming to another trial which looked exclusively at diabetes with hypertension, but it did not look at any specific target, or rather it did not look at hypertension specifically, but rather divided all patients with diabetes, irrespective of their baseline blood pressure status, to receive either a fixed dose combination of perindopril indapamide or receive placebo. Of course, this trial had a decrease in the composite vascular outcome as its primary endpoint. But what this trial also showed us that was with reduction in the systolic blood pressure, there was significant improvement in renal outcomes, and this improvement persisted without any lower threshold of systolic blood pressure for benefit, implying that the lower systolic blood pressure you attained with this combination in patients with diabetes, the better was your renal outcome. The SPRINT study was another study which looked at blood pressure goals, but again, it did not include patients with diabetes. But then again, if you look at the SPRINT inclusion criteria, there were some patients with pre-diabetes, and there was a good majority, nearly 40% of patients in the SPRINT trial, or about 4,000 individuals, had pre-diabetes with hypertension. And it was found that if you looked at the results of the SPRINT trial, the group with pre-diabetes got the same cardiovascular benefit as the group with normoglycemia. And we know that pre-diabetes and diabetes is a spectrum. So possibly the benefits which are seen in pre-diabetes, which is the stage before diabetes, having insulin resistance as well, the same results could possibly be got again when the patients would develop diabetes as well. Again, if you look at the systolic blood pressure attained in the intensive arm of the SPRINT study, it was around 121 millimeters of mercury. So if you look at office blood pressure measurements, since the SPRINT trial used automated oscillatory blood pressure, an extrapolation would be that if we take the results of the SPRINT study in pre-diabetes group of individuals, in diabetes with hypertension, office blood pressure of around 130-ish would be something which could give cardiovascular benefits to our patient. Now again, we are stuck at a blood pressure level of around 130 and around 140, which the SPRINT subgroup of pre-diabetes as well as the ACCORD BP trial tried to look at. Now, which one of two in the office, if you look at office blood pressure measurements, which one of these two is desirable? Is it less than 130 or is it less than 140? Again, there was no single prospective trial which looked at these two targets in terms of office blood pressure measurements. But if we pull together studies, most of which looked at office blood pressure measurements in patients with diabetes, if you look at meta-analysis, we get a pattern in these results. What we get to see is that if you reduce the systolic blood pressure to less than 130 millimeters of mercury, you do get stroke benefits in most of these studies. You do not get benefits in terms of reduction of myocardial infarction, and you do get stroke benefits at the cost of increase in adverse effects. So if you look at all these studies, less than 130 millimeter of mercury office blood pressure will possibly give us stroke benefits, will possibly give us renal benefits at the cost of increased adverse effects, but there won't be any benefits with regard to myocardial infarction in all probability. Again, regarding diastolic blood pressure goal, there is no single dedicated study in diabetic hypertensives which has looked at diastolic blood pressure goal. But if we pull together subgroups of studies which try to look at a more intense diastolic blood pressure goal compared to a more relaxed diastolic blood pressure goal, we do see a pattern. If you look at the intense diastolic blood pressure group, the mean diastolic blood pressure attained was around 76 millimeters of mercury. And in the conventional group, again, it was around 83 millimeters of mercury. Now, with lower diastolic blood pressure attainment, it was found that there was a big numerical decrease in all-cause mortality, which missed statistical significance by a whisker. And if you look at individual studies, subgroup analysis, for example, the HOT trial, the group with diabetes with a diastolic blood pressure of less than 80 millimeters of mercury had about a 50% reduction in the risk of cardiovascular events. So there again, possibly a lower diastolic blood pressure in patients with diabetes and hypertension is something which could give us some added advantage, provided it can be attained safely. Again, when we talk of diabetes and hypertension, we do get a big number of patients who would be in the age group which we bracket as elderly. In elderly with diabetes and hypertension, frankly speaking, there's a huge paucity of data. But from what we have data, we can say that the systolic blood pressure should be a bit on the higher side. Rather than attempting a systolic blood pressure of less than 130, it should be somewhere between 130 to 140. If the systolic blood pressure comes down below 130, or if the patient suffers from postural dizziness, it would be better to down titrate therapy. Because in this elderly group of patients with diabetes, hypertension, a systolic blood pressure of less than 130 has not shown any cardiovascular benefit in any study till date. Again, if your individual is frail, if your individual has a lower life expectancy, has multiple comorbidities, polypharmacy, is prone to falls, it would be better to target even a higher systolic blood pressure of something between 145 to 160 millimeters of mercury. We know that with aging, arterial stiffness increases. This leads to an increase in the systolic blood pressure, the decrease in the diastolic blood pressure, widening of the pulse pressure. So if your patient, elderly with diabetes and hypertension, has a pulse pressure of more than 60 millimeters of mercury, you should avoid the diastolic blood pressure going below 65 to 70 millimeters of mercury. And this should be much more strict than the systolic blood pressure goal, because it has been seen that in those in whom the diastolic blood pressure goes below 65 to 70 millimeters of mercury with a wide pulse pressure in the elderly, it could actually lead to worsening of renal function. It could actually lead to more cardiovascular mortality and more all-cause mortality. Next, after looking at the targets, we'll look briefly at which antihypertensive to use. And then again, this is $1 million question. And as goes with most $1 million questions, we don't have one definite answer. Most of the guidelines tell us that we could use either a RAS inhibitor or a calcium channel blocker or a thiazide-like diuretic as monotherapy in the beginning. Beta blockers should be avoided unless there is a compelling indication like underlying ischemic heart disease, an acute coronary event, heart failure, or atrial fibrillation, because beta blockers have been shown to worsen dyslipidemia, worsen blood glucose control, and even cause hypoglycemic unawareness. If you look at individual guidelines, there are two guidelines which are an exception. One is the International Society for Hypertension guideline, and the other is the International Diabetes Federation guideline, because both these guidelines tell us that we should begin with a RAS inhibitor as first line in patients with diabetes and hypertension. And I think that is what the majority of our audience thinks today, as the poll showed, irrespective of what the other guidelines tell us. And we know that there are studies, although these are small, some of them are observational, that RAS inhibitors improve composite cardiovascular outcomes in diabetes. They reduce the progression to advanced kidney disease in diabetes. And of course, if your patient with diabetes and hypertension has albuminuria, these are undoubtedly the best agents to use, as I think will soon be shown in the next talk. If you look at individual monotherapy and the data which is there regarding protection from target organ damage, and I have elucidated the trials which have tried to look at single monotherapy and target organ damage within the parenthesis. If you look at the kidney, again, RAS inhibitors are a clear winner. If you look at the brain with regard to stroke prevention, we have a bit more data with calcium channel blockers, and we do have data with the RAS inhibitors as well. With regard to heart outcomes, atherosclerotic heart outcomes or heart failure outcomes, we do have data with both the RAS inhibitors as well as diuretics with regard to improvement. This is an area where calcium channel blockers do not have good data. And of course, there is anecdotal evidence that ACE inhibitors could improve some retinal outcomes as well. But then again, when we talk of monotherapy in diabetic hypertensives, I think it's more of a theoretical area, because more often than not, your patient with diabetes and hypertension will require at least 2 antihypertensives, if not 3 or even 4 antihypertensives. And when we talk of combination therapy in diabetes with hypertension, the guidelines tell us that if your initial blood pressure is more than 160 by 100 millimeters of mercury, you then go for a fixed dose combination or combination therapy right away in order to attain your blood glucose goal. Now, I think that even in certain individuals who have lower blood pressure levels, something between say 150 to 160 and 95 to 100 millimeters of mercury, in some of them, I would still go with a combination to begin with, because one, I have a greater chance of attaining the blood pressure goal. Two, when I use a combination, I use a lower dose of individual agents, thereby reducing the chance of getting an adverse effect from one of these agents. Again, which combination to choose from? If you look at the published data in diabetes and hypertension, we do lack good published data here. If you look at subgroup analysis of at least 4 different trials, what we get to see is a specific pattern where ACE inhibitor, particularly perindopril, either in combination with indapamide or with amlodipine, has data to show that if you use this combination in patients with diabetes and hypertension, you could get benefit in terms of cardiovascular outcomes, particularly with regard to a decrease in stroke. Now, having spoken about targets and having spoken about which drug to use, I think there are two important things which we shouldn't forget when we are managing diabetic hypertensive. Something which is very important is lifestyle modification, particularly cutting down in salt intake, salt which is there in processed foods, salt which is added, extra salt which is taken along with diet. In addition to that, exercise, weight reduction, avoiding smoking, alcohol, taking a healthy diet, because when put together, these interventions could reduce systolic blood pressure by as much as 11 millimeters of mercury and diastolic blood pressure by as much as 8 millimeters of mercury. So you get reduction as good as an antihypertensive agent at zero cost and without any adverse effect. The other thing which we possibly need to keep in mind is chronotherapy, the timing of antihypertensive therapy. Because I think we do have some studies now which show that if you give your antihypertensive at bedtime, you reduce the blood pressure a bit more better than giving it at daytime. Particularly, you help recreate the nocturnal dip better. And of course, there are some meta-analysis rather as well, which shows that chronotherapy, timing the antihypertensive at bedtime, will reduce your cardiovascular risk further than giving it during daytime. I think that shifting the drug to the nighttime to bedtime won't cost an extra paisa, but would possibly give benefits. And this is something which we need to practice routinely as well. So again, coming towards the end of the discussion, what should be the target blood pressure in patients with diabetes and hypertension? I think it should be something between 120 to 130. Again, depending on the patient's clinical status, it could be closer to 130 or closer to 120. I would particularly target closer to 120 in patients in whom there is a risk of progression of renal disease, in patients who have a high risk of stroke, and the diastolic blood pressure would be something between 70 to 80 to 85. I'd be more comfortable keeping the blood pressure between 75 to 80 as far as the diastolic is concerned. Which drug to use? I think although most of the guidelines gives us a cafeteria choice, I would go with the ISH and IDF guidelines, begin with a RAS inhibitor. The second add-on would be mostly a calcium channel blocker, a diuretic in some instances. But having said that, I think in patients, for example, with a past history of stroke or patients with heart failure, I would be more comfortable using a diuretic. Again, when it comes to diuretic, I think if you look at the bulk of the evidence regarding benefits of using diuretics, they are with indapamide and chlorthalidone. And if I have to compare between indapamide and chlorthalidone, indapamide would possibly be better in terms of being metabolically neutral, while chlorthalidone would lead to some degree of dyslipidemia, dysglycemia, and hyperuricemia as well. If you look at hydrochlorothiazide, we don't have big trials, good trials to show that use of hydrochlorothiazide reduces cardiovascular events. And of course, beyond these numbers, beyond which drug to use, lifestyle change is something which needs to be ensured. Shifting the medication to bedtime is something which needs to be ensured. Going back to our patient had a baseline cardiovascular risk, which was reasonably high. If you go by the ADA guidelines, anything more than or equal to 15 is high cardiovascular risk. So possibly we should go for more stringent BP control in this individual. Hydrochlorothiazide was the drug with which we began treatment. We began it after breakfast, and our target blood pressure in this patient was not attained. It was 138 by 88 millimeter of mercury, and we continued the same treatment. So there were several areas in which we could work on in this patient. ACE inhibitor or ARB would be something which would be the best, I think, to use in this patient as first line. It should preferably be used after dinner at bedtime, and lifestyle modification is something which should be ensured in all individuals. And given this individual's high cardiovascular risk, younger age, not very young, but 60 years with a reasonably long life expectancy, I would target a blood pressure of less than 130 by 80 millimeters of mercury. I would either increase the dose of the RAS inhibitor or preferably shift him to a low dose fixed dose combination of a RAS inhibitor with a calcium channel blocker and a diuretic like indapamide. I think that I'll end my part of the discussion here, and I'm sure that all of you would agree with me that when it comes to management of hypertension and diabetes, it's a case of individualization, which is of paramount importance. Thank you. And now we'll take up the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shomi Goswami, for a very crisp presentation. Now, I think that it is a good time to start one or two question and discussion. And I would like Dr. Sandeep Mahajan to also chip in as and when. One of the things, Shomi, you might have seen is that being endocrinologist, we see increasing number of overweight and obese patients with diabetes in our clinic. We also know that obesity and hypertension have a linear relationship, as you see in Framingham Heart Study or Nurses Health Study. And we also know that correlation is better with the waist-hip ratio. Now, when we are trying to treat hypertension in this group of patients, I think lifestyle intervention plays a very, very important role. Now, to be more specific in this patient, I believe that most of the patient, I'm not saying all, usually need like diabetes, the two drugs starting. And in this patient, you can see that the patient is already on a diuretic and still not controlled. So probably we need a two drug. I find very comfortable using a Coversil Plus, to be directly say the name, starting perindopril and indapamide, or even an ARB, like there are combinations available with telmisartan and indapamide and things like that. So is that normally your choice also, Shomek? And of course, I want Dr. Mahajan to chip in. I know there is a more renal angle to his talk, but well, sure.
I very much agree, 110% agree with Dr. Tirthankar Chaudhary, because unlike what the guidelines tell us that when it's above 160 by 100, you then use a two-drug combination. When it's between 140 to 160 and 90 to 100, you begin with monotherapy. What I found in my practice is once I think the systolic blood pressure is between 150 to 160 and the diastolic is between say 95 to 100, a monotherapy will rarely take you to target, because we are looking for a stringent target of around 130 to 80 or even lower in our patients. So in most cases, it's a fixed dose combination of two drugs at a low dose.
And Shomek, where do you place CCB's calcium channel blockers in your practice of treating hypertension?
I think since I mostly deal with diabetes and hypertension, calcium channel blockers come after the RAS inhibitors. They mostly come immediately after the RAS inhibitors or after a RAS inhibitor with a thiazide-like diuretic. Again, if you look at the data in stroke prevention, they have big data. So if someone with a past history of stroke, I would be very comfortable using a calcium channel blocker. In patients with impending heart failure, that is an area where possibly I would avoid using a calcium channel blocker. That is an area where the other drugs, the diuretics and the RAS inhibitors do better.
Absolutely. I think that's very important. Last tag, what he said is basically when we are treating hypertension with diabetes, we also have to keep in mind about the complications that have set in, especially the macrovascular and things.
And talking of calcium channel blockers, I think there's some evidence with dihydropyr calcium channel blockers regarding the renal benefits, which I think our nephrologist colleague will better elucidate later on.
I want to chip in Dr. Mahajan, but I know that you usually probably come across 3 drugs to start rather than 1 or 2. So renal should come in with a more number. So let me know your choice.
Well, the joke goes, what a nephrologist tries for 1 patient, a cardiologist would write for 10. So our patients actually go on a bulk of antihypertensive drugs. Calcium channel blockers probably are the most potent antihypertensives we have in our armamentarium. So for us, yes, we usually start off with the 2 or 3 drugs straight up. So calcium channel blockers invariably is one of them. There always has been a controversy between dihydropyridines and non-dihydropyridines. Well, technically, if you look at everything which ends with a dipene, which is suffixed with a dipene, is actually a dihydropyridine. So you take amlodipine, nifedipine, you take cilnidipine, you take perindopril, you take you take benedipine. They all are dihydropyridine. They might be somewhat different in the way they act as a calcium channel blocker. Some might act on a single, or some might act on 3 drugs, 3 channels of calcium channel blockers. Non-dihydropyridines, predominantly verapamil is only for cardiac events. It's only controls the heart rate. It's basically diltiazem we are left with. We have some data saying that diltiazem does decrease proteinuria independent of the BP effect. But again, diltiazem then becomes a very low potent antihypertensive one, and you are then restricted by the use of a simultaneous use of beta blockers, which is another very useful addition to our to our set of patients. So we usually end up writing a dihydropyridine, and amlodipine is probably the most well written, being the most potent. Pedal edema is one side effect which most, if not less, around 40% do come back with pedal edema. Most of the time we try to reassure the patient and send them off. If it becomes really troubling, then we go in for cilnidipine or benidipine. Cilnidipine, unfortunately, is a low potent antihypertensive. It hardly reduces BP as good as amlodipine. And for us, that is the basic criteria. Benidipine comes somewhere in between. It's a useful antihypertensive. Maybe potency is much more than cilnidipine and a bit less than amlodipine. So that's a useful addition. And maybe it's reassurance and adding a diuretic along with amlodipine, which we follow most of the time.
Thank you, Dr. Mahajan. Can't agree more. And I think because I'll leave some questions to discuss at the end also, because in the interest of time, Arun,
Yeah.
should we go to the next talk or some Q&As from audience?
There are some Q&A, sir, so we can take some, and then for the second session we can take. So I can tell some questions which we can take. So Dr. Sujit from Chandigarh asked that there's a long-standard diabetic and hypertensive treated with ACE inhibitor and CCB with indapamide, and he gets postural hypertension in next few years, and they stopped all drugs except CCB, and now after 5 years BP is again 155/70, age is 78. What is the further management?
Okay, so Shomik, you want to take up that question?
I think if the age is 78, then I would be rather cautious regarding the blood pressure goals. As I discussed earlier, if your age goes up, particularly if you are frail, it depends on the comorbidities. If the patient is otherwise healthy, if the patient is not frail, I would possibly target the systolic blood pressure between 140 to 150 millimeters of mercury, taking care at the same time to avoid the diastolic dropping below 70 millimeters of mercury. On the other hand, if I feel that the patient has limited life expectancy, is frail, is at chance of developing postural dizziness, I would simply observe the patient. If the patient does not have hypertension mediated end organ damage, if the patient doesn't have any evidence of say LVH, albuminuria, normal renal function, I would simply follow up the patient, go for more strict lifestyle modification rather than initiating therapy. It again depends on the patient, individual patient I'm dealing with.
Thank you, Shomik. I think just wanted to, I was thinking that one of the most important would be probably to look at the cause of the giddiness and the cause of his getting this vertigo or whatever. Because it is not always due to, as we would presume our blood pressure tablets are doing. So we need to treat and address that, number one. Second is, I totally agree with Shomik that we can, since the elderly patient, we can slightly compromise on the systolic front as well. But I think there are many issues, pharmacological and non-pharmacological, that might help in addressing the actual cause of giddiness. And that should not make us compromise our systolic target. So that is something that I thought should be also I should mention. And what do you think, Shomik? Am I right?
And exactly. And just to add, when we talk of postural dizziness, the two worst culprits have been found to be alpha blockers and the diuretics. The RAS inhibitors do cause some first dose hypotension, but over a period of time, if you time them during bedtime, that hypotension goes away. So if you are to take off drugs, I would first take away the alpha blocker if the patient is on that, and then I would take away the diuretic. I would keep the AC inhibitor and the calcium channel blocker if they are on that for a pretty long period of time.
And also long-standing diabetes can give you some autonomic dysfunction.
Autonomic
we keep everything in mind, of course, and of course the neurological causes. So that is something to say for everybody, that we need to look very hard on the patient's complaint before we are superficially concluding why this is happening. Any comment from Dr. Mahajan, if you want?
No, we are pretty clear on that. So as we just see the comorbidities and maybe look at the sitting blood pressure rather than the supine blood pressure while targeting the blood pressure. So.
Absolutely. Yes, Dr. Arun.
Yeah, there's a next question by Dr. Sanjeev, that what is the best drug in post-MI for long-term prevention? Patient is a known diabetic with hypertension and dyslipidemia.
What is the best drug for?
in post myocardial infarction patient for long-term prevention. Patient is a known diabetic with hypertension and dyslipidemia.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Arun. First is the question is not very clear. Long-term prevention of what? Obviously, if somebody has got a myocardial infarction, I'm sure heart failure thoughts are coming in mind. And you are also, heart failure is a very important issue. And of course, I'm not very sure what the question is asking about. If he's asking about the best antihypertensive in that scenario, then of course, you know that we need to, of course, this patient will need 2, 3. So we need to also evaluate in terms of heart failure. There should be some place for the beta blocker. Since the patient has got an MI, you should assess the heart failure status. You should look at the hypertensive target. And Shomik, chip in on that.
I think we are very, very much agreed. If there's a compelling indication, a beta blocker is necessary. A RAS inhibitor also in a post-MI state is necessary. And when we are treating diabetes and hypertension, we should not forget the diabetes part as well. Because in this patient, possibly a SGLT2 inhibitor or a GLP-1 receptor agonist would take care of some blood pressure and give some cardiovascular benefits as well.
It is interesting that of course, not immediately after, but after some time when you start SGLT2 inhibitor, that even if on the BP reduction is 2 to 3 millimeter, it has been found that the sympathetic overdrive is taken care very nicely, even by that small reduction. Very interesting molecule. Of course, SGLT2 is a different topic altogether to discuss over. So let us, should we go to Arun? Should we now start with Dr. Sandeep Mahajan?
Sure, sir. If you want, we can take one last question since there's so many.
You are the boss.
No, sir. We'll take one more. Can go. Dr. Srikanth asked that, is there any role of aspirin in such patient, diabetic hypertensive, to prevent cardiovascular risk as primary prophylaxis?
Well, very interesting question, because at one point after the university group study and all, aspirin was everywhere. But today we know that we are really individualizing the patient, and we are not giving a blanket treatment of aspirin to the patient of diabetes and hypertension and to prevent the cardiovascular. In primary prevention, I'm talking about. In primary prevention, aspirin is no more throw material. At one point, I remember that it was almost like you have to give a statin and aspirin and the antihypertensive and everything. But nowadays, we are very wary of using aspirin, and unless there is secondary prevention, no problem. In primary prevention, you assess the cardiovascular risk. You look at the patient's smoking history, look at all the risk factors, and then probably we decide whether the patient would be an ideal candidate for aspirin. But we are getting increasingly reserved about starting aspirin in a primary prevention. Dr. Mahajan and Dr. Shomik, any comment?
I agree, absolutely.
It's your call also. So
okay.
In CKDs, though they are high risk, we are no longer giving prophylactic or a primary preventing aspirin therapy. So,
yeah.
Everybody
so we can start with the next section, sir. I'll put sir's slide for introduction.
All right. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Sandeep Mahajan. He's a professor, Department of Nephrology, All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi. And Professor Mahajan has a fellowship of International Society of Peritoneal Dialysis in June 2002, pursued at the Manchester Royal Infirmary in UK, educational ambassador for the International Society of Nephrology, member of the Scientific Committee of Indian Society of Nephrology and Peritoneal Dialysis, and national faculty for the Public Health Foundation of India. And he has a select list of publication of, presently have around 90 publications and in reputed national and international journal. And his field of interest is peritoneal dialysis screening for CKD and non-traditional risk factors for cardiovascular mortality in CKD and renal transplantation. I'm very pleased to welcome you, Dr. Mahajan, to give your presentation.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary. My job actually has been made a lot easier by Dr. Soumik, who already has covered quite a few things, intricacies of hypertension with significant comorbidities. Well, hypertension in CKD becomes a pretty unique thing because the prevalence is incredibly high. depending upon the age and the stage of chronic kidney disease, the prevalence would be around 60 to 90%. And as we were informally chatting before, majority of our patients, in spite of best efforts, have poorly controlled blood pressure. A good majority have what we now call as a resistant hypertension. And it's not only hypertension we are talking about the cardiovascular disease as well as the progression of chronic kidney disease. So they are closely interlinked. A poor blood pressure control would lead on to increased cardiovascular risk profile as well as enhance the progression of CKD. And patients with chronic kidney disease unfortunately come with constellation of lot of comorbidities like diabetes, obesity, smoking, and it's just to name the few. And if you now see the altered pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics which happen with chronic kidney disease, controlling hypertension in chronic kidney disease at times can become really frustrating for the nephrologist, and we really have to prescribe pills by dozens to actually get to somewhere resembling a control. This slide is just to tell you the drivers of hypertension with chronic kidney disease, and just to highlight, it's predominantly altered or a decreased salt and water metabolism.
Sir, you have not started the slide sharing. Just to
I think so. I had, just hold on.
yes. I thought I'll remind.
Okay. So is it there now?
Yes, sir. You can just put it in slideshow. Perfect.
Okay. There it goes. I'm sorry for. I think so. We have covered all this. So this is just talking about the pathogenesis. Once the chronic kidney disease set in, there is an alteration in sodium and salt and water excretion, and plus there is alteration in the neuroendocrinal mechanisms leading on to sympathetic nervous system overactivity, as well as altered renin-angiotensin system. All this in the end would lead on to salt and water retention, increased extravascular volume, increased arterial stiffness, and peripheral vasoconstriction, all leading on to systemic blood pressure, systemic hypertension. And as I had spoken earlier in the introduction, hypertension is both a cause of chronic kidney disease as well as a driver for chronic kidney disease, and the vice versa is also true. Chronic kidney disease is an important cause for hypertension and is a driver for hypertension. So these two pathophysiologies share a close interaction with each other, leading on to formation of a vicious cycle. And that's where our role as physicians and nephrologists come in, to break this vicious cycle. So just to start off with a case summary, mine is a bit shorter than what Somek had presented. It's basically a 64-year-old male, a non-diabetic, who is hypertensive for past 7 years, has no other comorbidities, and is referred to us for an increase in serum creatinine, which is sustaining around 2 to 2.1 for past 4 months. This is our routine prescriptions. This is our routine, the way the patients are referred to us. So just to start off with the audience poll, how many of you think that it would be useful to characterize the stage of CKD, both by looking at the estimated GFR and albuminuria in this patient? So it's a simple yes and no.
So we have
Dr.
some
Arun,
answers.
let us know. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Some answers coming in. We'll give another 15 seconds.
Okay.
Another 10 seconds, sir. Okay. So, sir, we have 98% with yes.
Oh, that's good. So that makes my job easier.
Good.
Well, we now have this fresh classification, which though is almost 8 years old. This is what we call as the CGA classification of the fresh CGA. C stands for the cause, G for the glomerular stage, and A for albuminuria of chronic kidney disease. This was proposed by K. Digo in 2012. So we basically have a stage G1 in which essentially you have a normal renal function or even a hyperperfusion as in early stages of diabetes with or without albuminuria. Stage 2 would be a slight decrease, but stage 3 is where we really start getting a hit for chronic kidney disease. You would have a GFR of less than 60, and this can is now divided into stage 3A and 3B, and stage 4 and 5 are more severe chronic kidney disease. The most interesting change has happened in how we describe albuminuria. We no longer have terms of microalbuminuria or a macroalbuminuria. We now call them as A2 and A3, which is moderately increased and severely increased. Another very interesting thing in this chart, if you see, is that this basically tells you the color code of the risk of CKD progression. And incidentally, it also holds true for the cardiovascular risk profile. So even if you have CKD stage 3A and you are in a stage of A2 or A3, you would have moderate to severe chances of progression of CKD as well as of a cardiovascular event. And even if you have no albuminuria or a stage A1 with a severely decreased renal function, that is stage 4 and 5, you are at a higher risk for both of them. So this, in a very single snapshot, can tell you the importance of staging of chronic kidney disease and looking at albuminuria and how to correlate it with the subsequent risk of chronic kidney disease and the cardiovascular risk profile. In fact, part of this is already taken up by the European Society of Hypertension. And again, if you see, even if you have a stage 3 chronic kidney disease, they have not classically looked at albuminuria, but even if you have a stage 3 chronic kidney disease, even with a near normal or a high normal blood pressure, you are at a moderate high risk for subsequent hypertensive related complications, and therefore you have to intervene early. And if you have a stage 4 beyond chronic kidney disease, even at a high normal, you are at a very high risk of hypertensive related complications. So chronic kidney disease, as I said, plays a significantly important interplay with hypertension, and therefore, instead of treating them in isolation, they have to be treated in combination. So when we look further, this patient actually is at stage 3B. He has an estimated GFR of 32 ml per minute, though conventionally speaking, he just had a creatinine of 2.1, and he had an albuminuria of 500 milligrams, so he falls into stage A3. So in both sides, he is at a higher risk of progression for chronic kidney disease as well as cardiovascular problems. His standardized office blood pressure is noted as 134/84, and there comes my second audience pool. How many of you actually will aim for a more stricter blood pressure control in this patient?
We're just waiting, sir, for the...
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so just a couple of more seconds. It got launched with bit delay. We have some answers coming in. Okay, just 10 more seconds, sir. 84. Okay, so 80% have gone with a yes.
Okay, good. So, but unfortunately, as Dr. Somit suggested, we don't have very consistent guidelines there. So, chronic kidney disease historically has been actually excluded from all major hypertensive and cardiovascular trials. This is nothing short of what we call as a therapeutic nihilism. We know that these patients with chronic kidney disease are the ones who are likely to do the worst, and therefore nobody is willing to recruit them. And that's how the trials are conducted. They are conducted for a positive outcome, and very few are willing to risk high risk population to be included in those trials. As far as whatever trials we have are concerned, initially we started off trials which focused on slowing of chronic kidney disease and looking at the progression and renal outcomes. Subsequently, with the more newer trials coming in, they are predominantly hypertensive trials, primarily looking at cardiovascular endpoints and all-cause mortality. And chronic kidney disease or the renal progression or renal outcomes are only the secondary outcomes. So this graph basically shows the timeline. For past 2 decades, we have had few trials of hypertension in chronic kidney disease. Few have already been referred to by Soumik. The first one was MDRD. The second one was ASK in 2002 and RAIN. All 3 of them actually were non-diabetic populations. So they were basically looking at chronic kidney disease. The stages they included was G2 to G4 and albuminuric stage was A2 to A3. So all of them basically looked at significant burden of chronic kidney disease. But again, the blood pressure targets which they aimed were inconsistent. MDRD and ASK basically looked at the mean arterial pressure, which we know can be a various combination of a difference between systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So you can only extrapolate from the raw data or just extrapolate the mean arterial pressure of 92 being somewhere between 120 to 80 or 130 to 74, something like that. Both the MDRD as well as the ASK actually showed that if the patient has proteinuria of more than a gram a day, then having a more intensive blood pressure control, which in MDRD was described as the mean arterial pressure of 92, and in ASK was defined as a mean arterial pressure of 97, led on to significant renal benefits. The RAIN-2, which basically looked at addition of a calcium channel blocker to a ACE inhibitor for a better blood pressure control, didn't find any such difference or any such outcome difference between the two. Now coming on to the more recent trial, ACCORD, as Soumik discussed, was looking at a diabetic population. Unfortunately, like all hypertensive trials, they excluded CKD to the best. The exclusion criteria was creatinine more than 1.5. So whatever chronic kidney disease patients we had were basically albuminuric patients in ACCORD. SPRINT was a bit more adventurous. They took a GFR of till 20 as an inclusion criteria. But unfortunately, they excluded patients who had a proteinuria of more than a gram. So basically, they were looking at a stage G3 for chronic kidney disease with a non-album or with a moderate proteinuria. So, and they were basically looking at cardiovascular outcomes rather than the renal outcomes. So, but SPRINT obviously has been a landmark trial, and this was looking at around 2,600 patients in SPRINT who had chronic kidney disease, and the mean follow-up period is around 3.3 years. And what they found was that with intensive blood pressure control, which Soumik already described, was an aim of a systolic blood pressure of less than 120 in a experimental setting, which is difficult to obtain in our clinic. The composite cardiovascular endpoints and all-cause mortality were reduced to a tune of around 30%, around 20%. However, there was no benefit in the renal outcome, which was described as onset of end-stage kidney disease, and that is requirement of dialysis or transplant. So though in SPRINT, with chronic kidney disease, we had some benefit of a low systolic blood pressure as far as the overall mortality and the cardiovascular benefits were concerned. There was no benefit to renal endpoints. Well, this is a meta-analysis published almost at the same time in 2017 as SPRINT, and this basically analyzed the raw data of various randomized control trials we had. And this actually looked at around 15,900 patients in various stages of chronic kidney disease. Again, stages 3 to 5, stage 4 and 5, unfortunately have been excluded in most of the trials. And what they found was that the more intensive control of blood pressure you have, the better have been the mortality outcomes. Again, we are not talking about the renal outcomes, we are talking about cardiovascular and mortality benefits. So in case in patients we attain a systolic blood pressure of less than 125, and as you can see, the patient population is not much. We are only looking at 1,600 patients in the either groups. The benefit is around 18% or 20% if you have a systolic blood pressure of less than 125. So the lower the systolic blood pressure, the better are the cardiovascular benefits, even in chronic kidney disease, though we are not talking about the renal endpoints. So how these data have been interpreted by various guidelines. Again, as in diabetes, the guidelines have not been consistent. The ACC, or the American Heart Association, in 2017 or 18 came up with their guideline. They took into account the sprint data, and they suggested adjusting for the way the blood pressures were monitored in sprint. They kept a target of less than 130/80 in all adults with chronic kidney disease. Mind you, it's irrespective of the age, it's irrespective of the proteinuria or albuminuria. So all patients of chronic kidney disease, according to the AHA guideline, should be targeted to a blood pressure of less than 130/80. The European Society of Hypertension in 2018 published their guidelines, and they actually didn't take into account the sprint data because of the fact that there was a minuscule amount of population which was having chronic kidney disease. And they suggested that in patients who have adaptive chronic kidney disease, we should target a blood pressure of less than 130/80 if it is tolerated. And it clearly suggested that in patients who are more than 65 years of age, you should not target a systolic blood pressure of less than 120 and a diastolic blood pressure of less than 80. Again, very skeletal data or scientific data to actually support this. The recommendation came as 2C. Again, it's just an opinion without any scientific data. Very recently in January, KDIGO has come up with their public paper. It's still not published. It's still up for review. And they have been very adventurous. They have targeted a blood pressure of less than 120/80. We are talking about the systolic blood pressure. This is irrespective of the diastolic blood pressure. And it includes elderly, irrespective of diabetes mellitus and proteinuria. So these guidelines have, especially of the KDIGO, has been really controversial. The data, as I said, is just derived from what we have from SPRINT and a few meta-analysis. Both of them would at best be enrolling around 3,000 patients in each arm. So, but again, it's individualization of therapy which is more important. And as my next slide suggests, that we should be looking beyond guidelines and we should be taking a path of individualization while treating a patient. We have to look at the overall condition, the frailty, and most importantly, the patient's understanding of the disease before setting targets. We have a patient who is a farmer, who is living in a very humid environment, likely to sweat a lot, not likely to take as much fluid as we want him to take, does not have a good water supply, could have infective diarrheas. Setting a very tight systolic blood pressure can be a catastrophic for him. So we actually have to individualize our therapy before really following the Western guidelines. And as we had discussed previously, just following guidelines blindly can lead on to a very poor outcome. And again, as opposed to KDIGO, I would say that we have SPRINT data to follow, and then that would suggest SPRINT excluded patients who had a very advanced stage of chronic kidney disease. SPRINT excluded patients who were less than 50 or who were more than 85. SPRINT excluded diabetics. We have evidence to say that patients who have low diastolic blood pressure at SOMIC suggested, especially of less than 60, have higher chances of a cardiovascular mortality. So this was not addressed by SPRINT. And as I said, patients with chronic kidney disease already are on a bulk of antihypertensive. Having such a formidable target to follow, it would be really, really difficult. So if a patient is already on more than 3 or 4 antihypertensive drugs and having a systolic blood pressure of 140, I would go with that rather than adding another drug to make a blood pressure of less than 120, which at times would be futile. So I think so. Beyond the guidelines, we have to individualize the therapy for this patient, take into consideration his home environment, his educational status, his impetus to look after his health, rather than just having a one-size-fits-all systolic blood pressure guidelines. So I will still leave this question to the jury, to what individualization or personalization the physician wants for their patient. So now the current therapy. Currently, this patient is on lifestyle modification, is on amlodipine 5 milligrams per day, and is on chlorthalidone 12.5 milligrams per day. So that brings me to the third poll. How many of you would like to add a ACE inhibitor or ARB to this patient? So with SOMIC's presentation already before me, I know what the answer would be from most of the participants.
So we have some replies coming in, sir. Another 15 seconds, please.
Yeah.
Okay, another 10 seconds to go. Some more replies we have. Okay, sir, for this 100%, okay, 80% have gone with yes.
Okay, so Meg has done the job for me. So, well, just to give a pathophysiology, has how to RAS blockade can be helpful in chronic kidney disease, and again, quote unquote, especially albuminuric chronic kidney disease. We know that there is activation of renin-angiotensin system with chronic kidney disease, as we had seen in the pathophysiology. This basically leads on to efferent arteriolar constriction and the efferent arteriolar dilatation. This is to maintain the single nephron GFR, what we call as hyperperfusion injury. And this is what leads on to progressive venous scarring. What an ACE inhibitor or an ARB would do is it would lead on to efferent arteriolar dilatation. This would reduce the glomerular hyperfiltration. This would decrease the glomerular pressure, in effect decreasing albuminuria or proteinuria, and this is documented in various trials. Another very important part about RAS blockade is that it has been shown consistently to have reduction in cardiovascular events. So this has been looked at in various cases of chronic kidney disease, both diabetic as well as non-diabetic, and this is a pretty robust data, looking at around 65,000 patients. And use of a RAS blockade can lead on to 40% reduction if we use an ACE inhibitor, and a 30% reduction in renal endpoint if we use an ARB. If we look at the cardiovascular event, a ACE inhibitor is likely to reduce it by 18%, a ARB likely to reduce it by 24%. Both of these are statistically not significant. The only statistical significant thing between the two is the all-cause mortality is shown to be reduced only by an ACE inhibitor, not by an ARB. So this is one controversy which always remains. Obviously, no talk on diabetic kidney disease, hypertension control, and RAS would be over without talking about these two landmark trials, the IDNT and the RENAL trial, both of which were published in 2002, which basically looked at placebo versus losartan and placebo versus losartan and amlodipine in around 1,500 patients, both divided into, in IDNT, it was divided into 500 each, and in RENAL, it was divided into 750 each. And it basically showed a relative risk reduction to end-stage kidney disease to a tune of around 20 to 30% in these two trials. So all of them were quite significant. Interestingly, both of these ARBS trials actually did not show any difference in all-cause mortality and composite cardiovascular endpoints. So the benefit was only renal as far as these two trials were concerned. So what are the guidelines using ACE inhibitors in chronic kidney disease? Well, here there is some consistency, though they would tend to agree to disagree. The ACC-AHA would suggest that all chronic kidney disease patients who have a stage more than G3, or even if G3, it's less than G3 with a A2, we should prefer use of ACE inhibitor and use ARBs only if ACE inhibitors are not tolerated. The European Society of Hypertension is more broad. It would say use RAS inhibitors for treatment of hypertension for any stage of chronic kidney disease more than G3 with or without A2. The KDIGO, which is, as I said, is still in public domain, would suggest use of RAS inhibitors for all diabetic and non-diabetic chronic kidney disease, PAN stages, G1 to G4, and albuminuric stage from A2 to A3. So according to KDIGO, irrespective of the stage of chronic kidney disease, as far as the G concerned, G1 to G4, we should be using ACE inhibitors, ARBs, with or without albuminuria. So these are as far as guidelines are concerned. So all of them in this patient would be consistent for the use of ACE ARB in this patient. So because it would fall into G3A2. So G3A3. So all of these guidelines would suggest a use of a ACE ARB. Now, just a brief word about diuretics in chronic kidney disease. As is clear from the pathophysiology, hypertension is mostly salt and fluid dependent in chronic kidney disease. So therefore, diuretics would have a role in that. Additionally, diuretics would have an additional antiproteinuric property, especially when they are used with a RAS inhibitors. So if you have a combination of a RAS inhibition with a diuretic, the potency of RAS inhibition to decrease proteinuria actually is increased manifold. So it's a better to use the combination. Thiazide diuretics have an additional vasodilatory property, which is often underestimated. So they can be useful. Though most of the guidelines would suggest use of thiazide diuretics till a GFR of 30. Higher doses of diuretics can be used even till a GFR of 20. Once you are looking at a GFR of less than 15, it's better to use a loop diuretic, especially a single dose loop diuretic, that would be torsemide, as opposed to furosemide. However, again, how much patient participates in his own health is very important. It's important that the patient should take a daily weight and then decide the dose of diuretics. If you are suffering from diarrhea, if you are dehydrated, and if you take a diuretic along with an ACE inhibitor, you are done. You are likely to end up into acute kidney injury, which we see so commonly in the community. So a patient's involvement in his treatment is very important when you are using polypharmacy, as we have to use in chronic kidney disease. And as a nephrologist, once we use high dose diuretics, we have to accept a fall in GFR to a tune of even 20 to 30% as a trade-off for a good BP control. So these are two important things, caveats of using diuretics in chronic kidney disease. There is bound to have some rise in creatinine or some fall in GFR, and the patient, especially in our hot and humid environment, has to be aware of his daily weight recording. So just one of my last slides, which would actually show the flow of management which we have for chronic kidney disease with hypertension. This is not to belittle non-pharmacological therapy. This has to be given, which would include reduction of salt, weight loss, shared decision-making, and continuity of care. DASH diet, which is rich in potassium, might not be so useful in our patients with chronic kidney disease who are already struggling with hyperkalemia. And if we give ACE/ARBs, they are already potentiate for use of hyperkalemia. Here I would like to put in a word about salt substitutes. Unfortunately, it's difficult to find a normal salt in a market now, and it's more frequent to find a salt supplement. They have very fanciful names, Tata Plus, Saffola, Lona, and whatnot. They are actually a bane for the nephrologist. The patient would not be knowing what salt they are using at home, and they would be coming back to us with hyperkalemia. And the cause invariably is that somebody puts into them that a doctor has told you sodium restriction, so you take a potassium salt, you take Lona. This you can take as much salt as you want, and the patients obviously are happy because it tastes better. But they forget that the trade-off is hyperkalemia, which can be a huge problem if you are using ACE inhibitors and ARBs, and mineralocorticoid inhibitors, which are again a good drug for us. If a patient has proteinuria, then there is no controversy. We should be using ACE inhibitors and a ARB with or without a calcium channel blocker for BP control. If the patient has no proteinuria, then again we would prefer a ACE ARB, but we can use a calcium channel blocker as a first line with or without a thiazide diuretic. If the blood pressure is still uncontrolled, we can switch around the initial drugs which we have used. We can use mineralocorticoid inhibitors. We can use beta blockers, especially if there are individual indications to use beta blockers. If the patient still has active proteinuria, we can look at the spironolactone and similar drugs. And as I've tried to highlight here, age, comorbidities, and co-prescriptions are very important considerations once we look at polypharmacy. So we have to balance all this. We have to look at the pharmacological and the pharmacokinetic profile before shifting from one drug to another or adding one drug to another. So just to conclude my talk, hypertension and CKD share a complex, vicious interrelationship. Once a patient has hypertension and chronic kidney disease, it's very difficult to treat. The targets needs to be individualized and is a dynamic process. And it depends upon the age, the stage of kidney disease, the comorbidities, and the renal and cardiovascular risk profile. RAS inhibitors are drug of choice because you improve both the renal and as well as the cardiovascular outcomes. So once we treat hypertension in chronic kidney disease, we are basically looking to kill 3 birds with 1 stone. That is hypertension, the cardiovascular risk profile, as well as the renal or the CKD progression. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahajan, for putting it excellently. And of course, you have tried to cover something that I wanted to chip in with. Now, but still I'll do it again so that for the larger audience, it is better to discuss. As an endocrinologist, and I think Shomik would agree, that whenever we find creatinine rising, the most of the nephrologists, what they do is stop the SGA inhibitor or ARB. And I'm very against that with my past experience of doing a diabetes nephro clinic. When I was teaching in Southampton, I used to do with Professor Mason. He was an, I don't know if you know, the nephrology. We used to do joint clinic. And I believe it's a RAS pathology is there. And unless there is a contraindication, and why should we stop that? But you have put it very nicely. But now I want you to dissect between a calcium channel blocker and ARB inhibitor. If there is any situation like rapid deterioration of EGFR or rising creatinine and contraindication. So can you place them exactly for lesser mortals that how to go about?
Well, as I said, the guidelines have been more liberal with the use of ACE inhibitors, ARBs, as opposed to what we are in clinics. The KDIGO would suggest that we even go till the use till stage 4, that is till GFR of 50. I agree. You would actually end up with some rise in serum creatinine if you use an ACE inhibitor or ARB, even in advanced stages of chronic kidney disease. But you are giving them a significant benefit of a cardiovascular mortality benefit. So the cardiovascular benefit should not be denied to a patient with a chronic kidney disease who have a GFR of say 20 or 25. The only point when we are afraid of ACE inhibitor is when you have hyperkalemia. And that's why actually I broke my tempo just to stress upon the dietary management of serum potassium. Because more often than not, why we have to stop ACE inhibitors is not creatinine, it is hyperkalemia. And patients take hyperkalemia quite casually. Nobody looks at their dietary intake of potassium. And as I said, salt supplements have become a big bane for nephrologists. It's a huge, huge problem in our clinics. The first thing which I think so we should give in and as a handout is don't use salt supplements if you have chronic kidney disease. It's okay if you're a normal person, if it's okay if you are hypertensive or if you have a coronary artery disease with a normal renal function. But if you have chronic kidney disease, please don't use it. It's a habit which has formed in the community. It is a habit which we as a physicians actually are encouraging. Once they don't have chronic kidney disease or they are in the early stages of chronic kidney disease, and this somehow actually percolates down, even if the patient has advanced chronic kidney disease, and nobody knows. I am actually happy in even starting ACE inhibitors, ARBs, if the patient has a GFR of less than 20. Among the ACE inhibitors, unfortunately, all of these agents, other than fosinopril, which is no longer available, are renally excreted. So if you use ramipril 2.5 milligrams or 5 milligrams with a GFR of 15, you are actually, with a 2.5, giving 10 milligrams of ramipril to a normal person, which can be a catastrophic dose as a first dose if you're giving an ACE inhibitor. You can have significant first dose side effect, you can have significant hyperkalemia, and you can have a rise in creatinine. ARBs that way are more nephro-friendly because they are not renally excreted. And therefore, if the GFR is frighteningly low, less than 30, then maybe I would use ARBs as a first line as opposed to ACE inhibitors. Though, as I have tried to highlight, ARBs have less proven overall cardiovascular mortality benefits as compared to ACE inhibitors. Though none of the guidelines other than the ACC actually differentiates between the two. It's commercial reasons, it's maybe pressure from the pharma companies, I don't know. But almost all the meta-analyses are very clear that if you have to look at the overall cardiovascular mortality benefits, ACE inhibitors outdo the ARBs. The only problem is cough, which quite a few patients develop, especially if you give high doses of ACE inhibitors. Then you have to shift to ARBs. And the other indication I told you, once you have a compromised renal function, you have to use ARBs because they are more, they are not excreted from the kidney. So once you are actually treating patients with chronic kidney disease, the metabolism, the pharmacodynamics actually become very complex. And therefore, we actually don't use fixed dose combinations because the combination dose would have different excretory properties. So a very common combination was amlodipine with atenolol, which a lot of people prescribe. Atenolol again is 80% renally excreted. So this combination would lead on to complete heart blocks, third-degree heart blocks in patients who had GFR of less than 15 and still were taking amlodipine atenolol combination. So it's a complex interplay of various things.
Dr. Mahajan, before I call in Shomek, do you want to have a comment on salt sensitivity in your experience in the clinic? Do you have varying salt sensitivity to hypertensive patients? And are you bothered with it?
Well, sir, it's a very good question. Chronic kidney disease among the pathophysiology varies from other causes of hypertension because impaired renal function or even with albuminuria could have salt retention from the kidney. So around 80% of hypertension in chronic kidney disease is actually salt dependent. So it's salt sensitive hypertension, 80% with chronic kidney disease. This might not be that true with general population. Again, our concept about salt sensitive hypertension, as you would be knowing, is changing remarkably. So what we used to call as idiopathic or a primary hypertension actually would only might be salt sensitive hypertension because of our genes, because of various sodium channels we have in our body, in the gut, in the kidneys. So this is actually, I would agree with most of the guidelines. Salt restriction becomes the forefront of hypertension management. We should restrict the salt to 5 grams the salt intake, or a sodium chloride intake of 5 grams, or a salt intake of, or a sodium intake of 3 grams. The only alteration is tubulointerstitial disease and chronic kidney disease, which actually are salt losing nephropathies. So we have certain sect which would be around 10 to 15% of chronic kidney disease, which would be a salt losing disease. And there, if we know there are salt losing nephropathies, we should not be restricting salt. But as I said, it's a niche set of patients, only 10 to 15, even in my practice. So general practitioner would encounter very few of them.
Dr. Shomek.
I think I very much agree. I very much agree with what Dr. Sandeep has shared. I think that when we use a RAS inhibitor, there will be some decline in GFR, some increase in creatinine. It's the same that we get to see with an SGLT2 inhibitor. It only means that these drugs are working.
Likely to
there's
work.
There's a decrease in hyperfiltration, decrease in intraglomerular pressure. So actually, these are the patients who would get more benefits over a period of time in terms of decreased progression to advanced kidney disease. So that is a trade-off which we need to do. And talking of salt again, I think it's important to realize that the average consumption of salt daily is around 11 grams per day. So 5 grams is way off. Even some reduction would help. And most of this, 3/4 of this is actually hidden salt. It's not the salt that we use to cook. It's the salt that is there in processed food. It could be the loaf of bread that you are eating. It could be pizzas. It could be the sauce that you are using. So avoid processed food, take fresh fruits and vegetables, and you will automatically cut down your salt intake. And as our nephrologist colleague was referring to, if you are using low sodium alternatives, the sodium is replaced by potassium to give you the same taste of salt. And that's very risky, particularly if you have DKD and chronic kidney disease, particularly if you are on a RAS inhibitor. So you have to be careful there and get in touch with your physician before actually opting for a low sodium salt.
Thank you. I think one of the thumb rule that I use is tell the patient half the salt everywhere. That is wherever you are taking, in cooking or everywhere. I think that does work probably, because I just asked them to half the salt. Now, I know the time is, Arun, are you all right with the time?
Sir, we are fine. I mean, we are enjoying the discussion, you know.
Okay. I just have a last question to ask everybody to come in. And that is, what is your thoughts about ambulatory blood pressure monitoring and its role? I'll start with a very small anecdote so that you can understand the relevance. I had an 18-year-old, just 18 plus, chap coming into my chamber, running pillar to post to the whole family. Very high value child, because all the brothers and sisters, he was the only male child, and was always surrounded by very loving parents and uncles and everybody. So he came to my uncle very harassed with everybody around that my son's blood pressure has gone up. So I was immediately thinking of course, secondary blood pressure, endocrine blood pressure, how to investigate and jump into a battery of tests. But before I do that, because I'm also slightly old-timer thinking that if clinically we can make a decision that how much to go on investigation. So I started taking the blood pressure, and I could find a very anxious group of guardians. So I took the blood pressure, then chatted for some time, retook it, again chatted it. I found it slowly coming down to a more reasonable range. So I had some suspicion. I said, can we do an ambulatory blood pressure monitoring in this patient before I do a battery? After that, I did from 2 places. And you'd be surprised. The nocturnal blood pressure, the daytime blood pressure, they come to be plumb normal. It was absolutely normal. And when he next time came, I said that can the guardian stay outside so that I can talk to the child about something. So they were even more encouraging. Something serious is going to happen. Doctors talking separately. He went out and I chatted with him about his schools and colleges and took the blood pressure. It was normal. So I told him in a big writing that this patient does not have high blood pressure. So with that context, share your experience or recommendation. Dr. Mahajan and Dr. Shomik.
Okay, so I take the call first then. Well, ambulatory blood pressure monitoring is one thing which has really changed the way we practice. We all know that white coat hypertension, MAST hypertension, lack of nocturnal dipping, they all are important clinical outcomes. They all have important clinical outcomes. It's not that they are benign. Even MAST hypertension, nocturnal dipping, they all have adverse outcomes in the long term. Unfortunately, why we did discuss it today at all was that the guidelines, the trials, all would take into what the data has come from. And all the robust data actually has come from the clinical blood pressure monitoring. We don't have long-term data from ambulatory blood pressure monitoring as till now. The second point is obviously the cost, the availability of the ambulatory blood pressure monitors. And third thing which I have noted in my practice is the standardization of the apparatus. We have some cheap, I can now say that a bit more openly, Chinese alternatives available to ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, which do a horrendous job. So getting a good standardized equipment, it's not that a company fellow has come to you and has offered you ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, you get it done. At times, those reports can be completely off target because the apparatus they might be using would be completely non-standardized. So getting a good standardized equipment is also one important thing. So if we have checked all the 3 boxes, we have affordability, we have a good standardized equipment, and we can really think of it. It's a very good modality. It might change in not so very distant future. Say maybe 5 years from now, we would be presenting all data about ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. It might come to that in another 5-10 years, who knows? So it's a beautiful thing. As you said, we all would have a number of anecdotal experiences of detecting MAST hypertension, detecting white coat hypertension just by smartly using our ambulatory blood pressure equipment. As far as how much we use it in our clinical practice, well, I would use it in patients who have severe hypertension, just to get to it as to it's only a clinic hypertension or it's a white coat hypertension. So patients who have severe hypertension, I would be routinely using my ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. In our department, we have 4 equipment for ambulatory blood pressure monitors. So we use it quite frequently. In renal donors, another condition is a voluntary renal donor who wants to donate, has a blood pressure which is plus minus, and we are really very cautious that we should not be doing any harm to this patient in long term by taking his kidney. We would do an ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. So these are the 2 conditions or in patients who have postural symptoms. The clinic blood pressures are fine, but at home they would be reporting postural symptoms. So this is these are the 3 important clinical settings where I am using routinely the ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. And as I said, the results have been fantastic. It at times really changes the whole prescription. It changes the whole paradigm of the way you manage hypertension. But we need to have better equipments and a bit more availability of these BP machines.
Can't agree more. And I think it is very important when we're discussing in such a forum that this has to be very niche version. We are not discussing this in general for the patients for the reason. But there will be, of course, one probably in a week or a month that will come across with high blood pressure, and then they go home not much complain, or they go home and immediately complain of difficulties and blood pressure. So there is a very niche and of course not meant for. Shomik, your experience and thoughts.
I think ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, again, if you look at recent studies, they have actually said that ambulatory blood pressure monitoring is more strongly correlated with cardiovascular risk compared to office blood pressure monitoring. But it doesn't apply to diabetes individuals because these studies have mostly excluded diabetics. Having said that, I think, of course, white coat hypertension is something which it picks up, but I think in picking up masked hypertension, it's something which is more important, because in masked hypertension, your cardiovascular risk is as good as someone with normal essential hypertension. So someone with early renal damage, say A2 albuminuria, some degree of LVH, early AV changes in the retina on fundoscopy, but having an absolutely normal office blood pressure, in them an ambulatory blood pressure monitoring often picks up an early loss of nocturnal dip, or you could get high daytime blood pressure. So these are patients masked early end organ damage, normal office blood pressure, in whom you could pick up masked hypertension. And talking of ambulatory blood pressure, again, as Dr. Sandeep put it, proper technology, good equipment is something which is of paramount importance. In our setting, if we don't have access to it, we can always resort to home blood pressure monitoring, which is sort of the poor man's ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. So if it can be done at several points of time, if the patients can be taught to do it, I think home blood pressure monitoring, the recent American Diabetic Association standard of care has made it mandatory for every patient with diabetes and hypertension to get a home blood pressure record. So I think that is another thing which could be helpful in our patients with hypertension.
I think this is a very important part of blood pressure we have been discussing today. And I would just add, not even home, the office. Because at office, mostly the blood pressure we get is, I sometimes get almost flabbergasted with the kind of pressure. I saw a nurse doing a blood pressure outside over a sweater in the winter and over a coat. And sometimes because they get a lot of patients, so they start doing it very quickly. And even people coming up, immediately sitting, immediately doing. I think blood pressure, taking the blood pressure, measuring the blood pressure remains a very fundamental issue before we start discussing about managing blood pressure. But I think ambulatory blood pressure monitoring is a very niche area, but it needs a very clear understanding for everybody. Dr. Arun.
Yes, sir. So we have a lot of questions, but due to paucity of time, I think we can take some couple of important ones.
Yes.
So Dr. Arindam asks that up to what level of serum creatinine can we safely use ACE ARBs, and how frequently do we monitor creatinine and potassium?
Very good question, Dr. Sandeep, because I was thinking this will be coming.
Yeah.
Okay.
So obviously, when to start and when to stop ACE inhibitors are two most troublesome questions for all of us. Well, as I said, I'm happy starting ACE inhibitor or ARB till a GFR of 20. That would roughly translate to a creatinine of 4.5 in a 40 or 45-year-old gentleman. For a person who is 65 beyond, we are looking at a creatinine of 2.5 to 3. So we not talk in terms of estimated GFR, which is just a simple calculation based on the serum creatinine, rather than talking about the serum creatinine at all. The second aspect is really important, and that is how frequently to monitor them. Well, once you are starting ACE inhibitors or ARB in a high-risk individual, in a patient who has a low GFR, or in a patient who is already on a diuretic, so it's important to call them back in a 10 days or a 2 weeks time to look at their renal functions as well as the serum potassium. A serum creatinine rise till around 20 to 30% is what we take as an acceptable rise in serum creatinine. And as Soumik said, this would actually reflect in a good percentage of patients as to the ones who are more likely to benefit from this intervention in the long term. And so we look at the long-term benefits rather than at the short-term gains, and we continue with the ACE inhibitor or ARB in this set of patients. Also importantly, whenever we increase the dose of these drugs, it's again important to tell them to come back after 2 weeks' time and get their biochemistry repeated again. So it's not only at the time of start, but also at the time of increasing the dose of these drugs that we have to call them back after 2 weeks and check it. Ideally, I will do it 2 times in a month. So fortnightly, after initiation of therapy, I will call them twice in a month, and that is fortnightly, to have their biochemistries done and to follow them.
I think it's a very important topic aside. And I also think that if Dr. Mahajan agrees, that once you start this and you are not changing the dose of AC or ARB, and if you get 2 successive biochemistry stable, then probably you are safer to say that let's do the test after a month. Yeah. I think that is something which is more practical, to be honest. But I know that when where the healthcare is free, you can do more tests more frequently. But yes, I think that we have started somebody on SCRP and 2-3 successive readings are stable and you are not planning to increase, then probably you can stretch a bit.
That's what I said, sir. You just call them twice in a month. That is
Yeah.
in 15 days gap, and that's done. If it's stable, you are not increasing the dose, then they come up as they come up routinely. That would be once in a 3 months.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Twice a month in our hospital will be a bit of tricky for the patient.
But that's only once you start. Yeah, ours is a government institute, so it's not
You
a
are
problem.
from government institute. Okay. Shaumik, any comments? Or is there any other question that we can take in?
Yeah, there are some other questions, sir. Dr.
Okay.
Ranjini asked, should we continue or discontinue ACE-ARB use when the patients reach stage 4 or stage 5?
Oh, so I think so. I left it half done. I told you it's starting and the ending of therapy, which is the most likely controversies we have. Well, at stage 4, we don't discontinue. I would discontinue only if the patient has persistent hyperkalemia in spite of dietary therapy. That is one way, irrespective of the GFR, I will have to discontinue an ACE inhibitor ARB. The second time I would discontinue is when you are looking at an impending start of a renal replacement therapy. That is once you are looking at a GFR of less than 15 or less than 10. At that time, there is no additional benefit of giving an ACE inhibitor or an ARB. And then it's time, actually, if we stop ACE-ARBs, you would have some improvement in GFR, and that gives you an extra time to prepare the patient for dialysis and renal replacement therapy. So my answer would be, one, irrespective of the GFR, if the patient has persistent hyperkalemia, in spite of best dietary management, stop ACE-ARBs. Number two, if the patient has a GFR of less than 15 and is likely to be initiated on a renal replacement therapy within 3 to 6 months of time, then you have to discontinue ACE-ARB.
Good. I think that is very well said, and that's what probably most of us are thinking. And I hope that's very informative for the general audience anyway. Dr. Arun.
Dr. Shambhu from Vizag asked that recent trials had shown CTD is not better than hydrochlorothiazide when it comes to heart failure. So what is the alternative?
Shaumik, give him a chance then. You are saying recent trials have shown?
I think there was a trial where the result was that they are similar in terms of heart failure. But again, if I look at the wealth of evidence, overall evidence, if I look at the ALL-HAT trial, if I look at other big trials, I think the data with clothianidone is a bit more robust. There is a lot of data that clothianidone acts better over 24 hours, the 24-hour BP reduction. It acts better in terms of efficacy, reducing the systolic blood pressure to a lower level. Of course, amongst diuretics, I think often we miss out on the third diuretic, which is indapamide, because if you look at evidence, it has a host of evidence to its name. It's metabolically neutral. So also consider indapamide when considering a diuretic. Amongst clothianidone and hydrochlorothiazide, my vote would go to clothianidone in terms of cardiovascular risk reduction, blood pressure reduction, but at the same time, the risk of metabolic side effects and dyselectrolytemia would possibly be greater with clothianidone compared to hydrochlorothiazide. So you have to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Normally, I try to float between indapamide and loop diuretic if you need be, because that sounds to be very safe and metabolically neutral, as said, and also very potent antihypertensive. Indapamide is also very good in reducing blood pressure. So, Dr. Arun, any more?
Yes, so there are one or two last questions. I'm just screening. There's a question.
8:43. So I think should we call it a day?
We'll take the last question, sir.
Okay,
on that
last
note.
one.
Yes. Hypertension with type 2 diabetes with dyslipidemia in a patient of 55 years with a BP of 180/90. He's already on ARB plus CCB plus a diuretic. What next drug should I use in this patient?
Okay, so Shaumik, you can chip in. We have got a patient who is 55 years old, and the patient has diabetes, hypertension, and dyslipidemia. The standard menu that we get. So diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia with a high blood pressure. Patient is already on 3 drugs, is it, or 2 drugs? ACE inhibitor and calcium channel blocker. Am I right? Arun?
Sorry, sir?
Is the patient on 2 drugs or 3 drugs for blood pressure?
Including diuretics. So
including diuretics.
Yes.
Okay, then it's at the end we are left with few. So Shomik, come in please.
So I think that first, again, lifestyle modification, I would like to go for optimal dosing of these 3 drugs. If that is satisfied, I would then add a 4th drug. The 4th drug would be a choice between a beta blocker or an alpha blocker. Again, although this is not a compelling indication, I would shift more towards a beta blocker here, something like a nebivolol or carvedilol, which has published data in patients with type 2 diabetes showing some benefit at the end of the day. And I think that something else which we need to keep in mind is the use of spironolactone, because again, the recent guidelines have shown us that the studies have shown us that in patients with refractory hypertension, it has a big role to play. But having said that, if your patient is given spironolactone and is on a RAS inhibitor, you have to be very, very, very careful regarding hyperkalemia. So spironolactone would be a good choice, not exactly a 4th line agent, but in a 5th line agent in some. The 4th line would be either an alpha blocker or a beta blocker. I would more tend to use a beta blocker in this situation.
Yes, of course, we agree to that. I think there is, from the other side of the table, it would also probably very interesting to look at the end organ damage at that stage while deciding the next drug, that exactly where we stand in terms of macro and microvascular complication. Second thing is, yeah.
And I think that the person who asked the question wanted this to be put across because there was dyslipidemia. So in spite of dyslipidemia, we give a beta blocker. Just like all those statins cause diabetes, we use statins. So you have to look at the risk-benefit ratio when you're using a drug.
Yeah. So I think that is one important. The other important is the duration of hypertension. If somebody is using 3 drugs already and not controlled, and if the duration of hypertension is very short, probably we need to look at the renovascular hypertension and other secondary hypertension as well. So from the other side of the table, probably I can add that we need to look at the all aspect. And of course, often the patient is not on the maximum tolerated dose of the different antihypertensive. Somebody is throwing like homeopathic doses of antihypertensives, and then you don't get the target. So Dr. Arun.
Right, so I think there are a lot of questions, but I think we can wrap it up since it has been pretty late. So over to you, so you can wrap up the.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think I thank Sardia in India very much for inviting us and giving us the call. It was a pleasure. I know Dr. Shomik very well. Pleasure to know Dr. Mahajan and this opportunity, and hope to see him more often during my visits in Delhi. And of course, I especially want to thank Sardia. I'll tell something about, I'm not from the company, but I'll still say it, because my association has been very long, even from Ukadale, and I had the opportunity of interacting. You know, in there, they invite consultants for when they get their senior managers, Glaxo, Sardia, Pfizer, they invite doctors, senior consultants said, and when they become senior manager, you are given the opportunity to give your feedback from your perspective about his perspective of medical side. That is a very interesting thing that I found there. And the Actos advertisement, if you all remember, with the babies cartoon, I was one of the South of England referee for that. So they would call us and do that. And then I realized that this is one company that is a non-profit organization. First time I realized that this company doesn't make profit out of selling drugs. They invest majority of it in R&D. And I was even more impressed to know that Jack Servier, am I right, Arun? He has not left his property to the daughters. He has kept this company. Am I right, Arun, if I'm saying?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, sir.
Yeah. He hasn't even passed on the assets to the daughters. He has made it a totally a humanitarian thing, a very philosophical and non-profiting. So I salute that, and thank you for my association with you all. And I think if Arun can finish with the last vote of thanks.
Yes, I think it was indeed a pleasure to have such an eminent speaker, and of course with you moderating the session. I think we did overshot, but I think it was a time well spent, because I think the discussions were so engaging, we did not realize the time. So I think for the audience, and I think for even us, the internal team, I think it was a great experience to be in such an august company. So once again, we thank you, Dr. Tirthankar sir, and Dr. Sandeep and Dr. Soumik, for such a interactive, engaging, and I think in-depth session, if I can say, and I think it was an intellectual feast. So for our audience, I just want to remind that we have just completed the day 2 of the hypertension management certification course. So do join us next week. We have 2 more sessions coming up on July 4 and July 5th. So we assure you that those sessions would be similarly engaging and relevant to you. And again, as I started and I said in the beginning, a big thanks from all of you, to all of you from us at Cerdia for spearheading this fight in this difficult and turbulent times. And we thank you for attending this course. So from Cerdia, this is me, Dr. Arun, saying thank you. So thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Sandeep, Dr. Saumik, Dr. Tirthankar, sir. Good night to you also. Thank you.
Good night. Good night.